And next we'll have Katherine. Her work.
So this is an interesting time to be talking about Myanmar. We're in a way at a moment of transition in the international narratives around human rights, if not necessarily in the state of human rights on the ground. Up until the past year and a half, there's been very little appetite to address human rights violations in Myanmar, even as they were continuing. We have a country who has been under a military dictatorship since 1962, suddenly having elections in 2010, in 2012, the NDL coming to power led by Aung San Suu Kyi, who's been really a revered figure of resistance and of hope for the future. So we found ourselves in the past 10 years in really a narrative of Myanmar as a symbol of hope towards moving towards democracy. But unfortunately, during the same period, we have continued and increasing human rights violations. And the narrative is beginning to change around that. So the issue that has really brought human rights to the forefront in the international community for Myanmar is the Rohingya, starting with the violence in 2017. Now, the Rohingya are a Muslim minority group in Rakhine State, which is a comparatively impoverished region on the border with Bangladesh. The Rohingya have been discriminated against for decades in Myanmar with the same general narrative that has been promulgated by the government in many ways and then amplified throughout society. And that narrative is that the Rohingya are not legitimate members of Myanmar, not legitimate citizens, but they're illegal immigrants from Bangladesh who have feigned this identity in order to gain status, in order to gain control in the country, and eventually take over an area as a Muslim state. And there's this idea of them committing massive armed violence. They're described by government officials at times as having an inhuman birth rate. So this real otherization of this community. This narrative is untrue, but it's gained a great deal of currency in Myanmar, and unsurprisingly, we've seen long-standing restrictions on the Rohingya. Legitimized arbitrary detention, forced labor, travel restrictions, restrictions on marriage, restrictions on access to education and healthcare, inability to gain citizenship, and this has been going on for decades. There have also been outbreaks of severe violence for decades at different points in the 1970s and the 1990s, and then again in 2012, which was the outbreak of violence that prompted my work with the Yale Clinic. In 2012, violence was prompted ostensibly by reports that Muslim men had sexually assaulted and killed a Buddhist woman in Rakhine State. And this resulted in rioting with hundreds of deaths, the destruction of thousands of homes, many communities razed across Rakhine State. And the government at this time described this violence as intercommunal. The Rakhine Buddhists and Muslims just can't get along here. This was, of course, at the same time as describing the Rohingya as somewhat less than human, so an interesting juxtaposition and rhetoric there. This violence displaced more than 140,000 people, and many Rohingya ended up either fleeing in ghettos in the towns where they were living, or in IDP camps that were really more like internment camps. So inadequate access to food, inadequate access to health care, severe travel restrictions. Then in August 2017, there's a new wave of violence. A Rohingya armed group, which is generally thought to be fairly small and fairly unarmed as far as armed groups go, not particularly sophisticated, attacked a number of military bases in Rakhine State. And the military launched what it termed as a clearance operation against the entire Rohingya population. There were mass killings, gang rapes, destruction of entire communities and settlements. The UN has said that 10,000 deaths is a conservative estimate. And then over 700,000 Rohingya fled to Bangladesh. So these attacks at this point prompted the creation of a UN fact-finding mission to conduct a preliminary investigation into the abuses of Myanmar. And what we're seeing right now are the initial results of that investigation. Notably, Myanmar refused any access to investigators. It refused to cooperate. It has said that the investigation was one-sided after its refusal to cooperate. And before I speak about the results of that investigation, I do want to note, even though I've spoken mainly about the Rohingya, I would be severely remiss if I implied that there weren't a number of other human rights violations in Myanmar. There are many ethnic groups there. There have been armed conflicts with many ethnic groups, such as in the Kachin and the Shan states. And in responding to conflict with armed groups, the Myanmar military has really launched large-scale attacks on civilian populations, indiscriminately killing and abusing civilians in areas. And the government, I'll also note, has maintained a severe crackdown on any dissent and even off-message truth-telling, not even rising to the level of dissent you might think. So many of you have probably read about the imprisonment of 2 Reuters journalists for 7 years last year for simply investigating the massacre of Rohingya. And ostensibly this was for a violation of a state law on secrecy, but there was really little pretense that these weren't trumped-up charges to shut things down. So in August of 2018, just a few months ago, we have the UN fact-finding mission's report released. This found severe violations of international humanitarian law with respect to the military's actions in Shan and Kachin, and then with respect to the operations against the Rohingya, focusing on the violence in August 2017 and moving forward. It found significant indicators of levels of forethought and an organized plan of destruction with the military in control that it found indicated a genocidal intent. So what does it mean to say something indicated a genocidal intent? Genocide consists of 3 elements. You have a protected group, you have at least one of 5 prohibited acts, and then you have to have the requisite intent, which is the intent to destroy that group in whole or in part. So there's no doubt that the Rohingya are a protected group. I think there's no real doubt that at least 4 of the 5 acts have been committed. Remember, you only need 1 necessarily. So everything hinges at this point on whether the requisite intent is there. So where does this leave us? The UN report recommended the investigation and prosecution of senior military officials to determine their liability for genocide. It named 7 specific officials, and it recommended either referral to the ICC or to an ad hoc international criminal tribunal, the ICC being the International Criminal Court. Now, Myanmar is not a state party to the ICC, but in September 2018, the ICC ruled that it could exercise jurisdiction at least with respect to the crime against humanity of deportation of the Rohingya, because the deportation occurred onto Bangladeshi territory, and Bangladesh is a member state of the ICC. The court also said that this justification might also be true for other crimes that involve some sort of cross-border element. And the ICC's chief prosecutor has announced that she was beginning a preliminary examination to establish whether there was enough evidence for a full investigation. I should note that this process can take years. Other alternatives, a Security Council referral to the ICC or the creation of an ad hoc tribunal, those would both require Security Council action, which most people think would likely be blocked by China. In the meantime, the UN Human Rights Council has voted to create an independent mechanism to collect evidence and prepare for later prosecution, essentially as stopgap measures. That's the legal status right now. On the ground, we still have a crisis. There are 1 million refugees in Bangladesh. There have been discussions about forced repatriation into Myanmar, which has not occurred, but would pose obviously serious problems given that there hasn't been a change on the ground in Myanmar where these abuses have taken place. And from the government, we've seen, the Myanmar government, we've seen much of the same rhetoric as we saw before this violence, before the UN reports, with a focus on the narrative of communal violence, not promulgated by the government, that we need to see both sides into, and a resistance to the narratives found credible by the UN and spoken by the refugees, an idea that this is kind of a conspiracy to discredit Myanmar. So I'll end there for now.
Okay, thank you very much.